I came home after the hardest fire of my career, exhausted, covered in soot, just wanting to see my fiancée. I knocked on the door, and a guy opened it, smiled, and said, "Oh, you must be the firefighter. She'll be out in a second." When she heard my voice and looked down the hall, I came home after the hardest fire of my career believing that the worst part of the day was already behind me. My gear still smelled like burned insulation and wet ash. My shoulders felt like someone had stacked concrete blocks on them one by one. The inside of my throat was raw from smoke that refused to fully leave no matter how much water I drank at the station. All I wanted was the quiet familiarity of my apartment and the person who was supposed to be waiting for me there. The call had gone bad early. It was a warehouse fire that spread faster than expected, with people trapped inside long before we arrived. We worked through heat that bent metal and floors that threatened to give out under our boots. I helped carry 2 victims out, both heavier than they looked, both unmoving in ways that stayed with me even after the sirens stopped. By the time command finally rotated us out, my hands were shaking in that delayed way that meant my body was still catching up to what had happened. I skipped the post-call talk and drove home alone. The radio stayed off. I did not want noise or commentary or anyone telling me I did a good job. I wanted a shower, clean clothes, and the comfort of seeing Brielle's face when I walked through the door. That image carried me through traffic and the long walk from the parking garage. When I reached the apartment, the hallway lights flickered like they always did. The carpet needed replacing. The place smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and someone else's cooking. All normal details. I knocked, because my hands were full, and because I expected her to open the door already smiling, already mid-sentence about something unimportant. The door opened almost immediately. The person standing there was not Brielle. He was tall, relaxed, wearing socks that clearly belonged in the apartment and a shirt I had never seen before. He did not look surprised to see me. He looked mildly amused, like someone opening the door for a delivery they had been expecting. He looked at my gear, my soot-stained jacket, my face, and smiled. He said something casual about me being the firefighter and added that she would be out in a second. The hallway seemed to narrow. The noise from inside the apartment did not stop. Music played softly from somewhere deeper in the place. The stranger did not move aside immediately. He stayed in the doorway, leaning slightly on the frame, comfortable in a way that did not match the situation. I stood there longer than I should have. My brain was slow, still stuck somewhere between the fire and the present moment. I noticed small things instead. His phone charging on the counter behind him. A glass with condensation rings near the sink. Shoes by the door that were not mine. When Brielle heard my voice, everything changed. I did not raise it. I did not shout. I simply said her name the way I always did when I came home. That was enough. She appeared at the end of the hall and stopped so abruptly that it was almost unnatural. Her posture stiffened. Her face drained of color. For a brief second, her eyes flicked to the stranger, then back to me, as if she was calculating distance, time, options. The stranger stepped aside then, finally, allowing me to see the full length of the apartment I had helped pay for. The couch cushions were rearranged. The coffee table was cleared except for one folded piece of mail I recognized as a bank envelope. The air smelled different. Not bad, just unfamiliar. I walked inside without asking permission. No one stopped me. Brielle said my name again, this time softer, slower, like she was testing how it sounded in the air. She looked at my gear, my hands, the dried soot on my face. She did not step forward to hug me. She did not ask if I was okay. The stranger watched us with open curiosity. I asked who he was. The question came out flat and factual. I did not feel anger yet, just confusion layered on top of exhaustion. She answered too quickly. A friend. Someone from work. Someone who stopped by because she was worried about being alone. None of that matched the scene. He knew where things were. He knew I was a firefighter. He knew she would be out in a second. That was not the knowledge of a casual visitor. I took off my jacket and set it on the back of a chair. Ash fell onto the floor. Brielle flinched at the sound. That small reaction told me more than her words had. I asked again, slower this time. The stranger answered for her. He introduced himself as Colton. He said it like his name belonged there. He added that Brielle had mentioned me before, in passing, usually when explaining her schedule or why she had plans canceled. That detail landed hard. He should not have known that much. Not unless he had been around long enough to hear those conversations unfold naturally. I turned to Brielle. She was shaking her head, already denying things that had not been said out loud. Her hands twisted together at her waist. She looked smaller than usual, but not fragile. More like someone cornered. I asked how long. She hesitated just long enough to matter. That was when the reality settled in. Not as a dramatic crash, but as a heavy certainty. This was not a single bad decision or an unexpected overlap. This was a pattern, a replacement already in progress. I noticed then that some of my things were missing. The framed photo from the trip we took last summer was gone from the shelf. The hoodie I always wore around the house was nowhere to be seen. My spare keys were not on the hook by the door. Colton mentioned that he had parked downstairs and would move his car if needed. He said it politely, like someone offering to be accommodating. I told him that would not be necessary. Brielle started talking faster. She tried to explain the distance, the hours, how my job made things difficult. She talked about stress and loneliness and how nothing had been planned. Each sentence contradicted the last in small ways that built a bigger picture than she intended. I asked her if anyone else knew. She avoided the question. That was answer enough. A neighbor passed by the open door and slowed, clearly sensing tension. Brielle noticed and stepped back, lowering her voice, asking if we could talk privately. The request came too late. Privacy had already been surrendered. I told her I was not staying. That was the first moment she reacted strongly. She stepped forward then, reaching for my arm, stopping herself just short of touching me. Her eyes darted again to Colton, who had grown quiet, watching carefully. I asked him if he planned to stay the night. He did not answer immediately. He looked to Brielle. That silence said everything. I picked up my jacket and slung it over my shoulder. My body felt distant, like I was watching the scene happen through thick glass. I was aware of how I must have looked to them. Exhausted, dirty, out of place in my own home. At the door, I stopped and turned back one last time. I told Brielle that whatever story she had been telling people, it was going to change now. Not because I planned to expose her or cause a scene, but because the truth had a way of surfacing on its own once enough people were involved. Her face tightened. Colton's expression shifted, just slightly. I walked out without slamming the door. In the hallway, my phone buzzed with a message from a coworker asking if I was okay after the call. I stared at it for a long moment before answering. I did not know how to explain that the fire was no longer the worst thing I had walked away from that day. As I reached the elevator, I realized something else had changed. The apartment was no longer a safe place to return to, and the life I thought I was building there had already moved on without me. That understanding followed me down to the parking garage, heavy and unavoidable. The fire had taken hours to put out. What waited behind that door had been burning much longer. I did not go back to the apartment that night. I drove without a destination until the streets stopped feeling familiar and the weight in my chest eased just enough for me to breathe. I ended up sleeping in my truck, parked on a side street a few blocks from the station, because it was the only place that still felt neutral. The cab smelled like old coffee and smoke, which was somehow easier to tolerate than the unfamiliar scent of my own home. When morning came, my body woke before my mind did. Muscle memory kicked in, the same routine as every shift day, except there was no gear to put on and no partner waiting by the engine bay. My phone was already full of missed notifications. Brielle had called several times. Messages followed, stacked tightly together, each one longer than the last. I did not open them. I knew that once I did, I would be pulled back into a version of events shaped to suit her. Instead, I focused on the practical things. I checked my bank account while sitting in the truck, the screen glaring in the early light. I noticed charges I did not recognize right away. Small ones at first. Coffee shops I never visited. A grocery store on the other side of town. Then larger ones that made my stomach tighten. Furniture rental. A gym membership. A streaming service bundle. All of it tied to dates when I had been on extended shifts. I drove to the bank as soon as it opened. The teller was polite and efficient, explaining joint account activity in a neutral tone that suggested she had seen this pattern before. The account was still active. No alerts had been triggered because nothing technically violated the agreement. Authorization had been shared. I realized then how thoroughly my absence had been used against me. Not as a weapon, but as permission. By the time I left the bank, my phone had started buzzing again. This time it was from people I did not expect. A cousin asking if I was okay. A friend from the academy checking in with concern that felt cautious. Someone from Brielle's office whom I barely knew sent a short message that read like an apology without context. Something was circulating already. I went to the station even though I was not scheduled. I needed the grounding familiarity of the place. The building smelled like disinfectant and oil. The engine sat lined up and ready, silent for once. A few of the guys looked up when I walked in, their expressions shifting as they registered my presence. No one said anything right away. Finally, one of the lieutenants pulled me aside. He asked how I was holding up after the warehouse fire. His tone was careful, the kind used when the question carried more than one meaning. I answered honestly about the call, keeping everything else out of it. He nodded, then mentioned that there had been a complaint filed. Not about the fire. About me. The words landed slowly. The complaint involved allegations of instability and aggressive behavior at home. It was framed as concern, not accusation, which made it harder to dismiss outright. He explained that protocol required it to be noted, nothing more at this stage. I understood immediately where it came from. I left the station with a knot forming between my shoulders. The betrayal was no longer contained within personal boundaries. It had started to leak into the one place I had always trusted. That afternoon, I finally listened to Brielle's messages. She talked about misunderstanding, about timing, about how everything looked worse than it was. She framed the night as a coincidence layered with stress. She avoided specifics and leaned heavily on how overwhelmed she felt. She mentioned Colton only once, describing him as someone who had stepped in to help when she needed support. There was no mention of the finances. When I drove past the apartment later that day, I did not stop. Instead, I watched from across the street for a few minutes. Colton came out carrying a gym bag that looked well used. He locked the door behind him without hesitation. That image stayed with me longer than it should have. I spent the next few days gathering information quietly. Not digging, not confronting, just observing. I learned that Colton worked in a neighboring department at Brielle's company. He had transferred recently. His schedule aligned suspiciously well with mine, overlapping most evenings I was on late calls. People at her office had known about him for weeks. Some thought we were already separated. Others believed I was difficult, distant, unpredictable. Those stories did not appear overnight. They had been planted carefully, repeated until they felt true. I contacted a friend who handled financial planning on the side. We went over the accounts together. He pointed out patterns I had missed. The way purchases ramped up gradually, testing limits. The way joint funds were used to set up what looked like a parallel household inside my own. The realization hurt less than I expected. It replaced emotion with clarity. Brielle asked to meet in person. She suggested a public place, which told me she wanted control over the setting. I agreed, choosing a location near the station where I felt steady. She arrived late, dressed carefully, like someone attending a job interview. Her expression shifted between concern and defensiveness. She talked about love and history, about how she never meant for things to spiral. She claimed Colton was temporary, a mistake born out of loneliness. I asked her why my name was being attached to instability complaints. Her face tightened. She said she had only spoken to a few people, that she was worried about me, that she wanted them to check in. She framed it as care. I told her to stop. The conversation ended without resolution. She left frustrated. I left with confirmation. Within the week, things escalated again. The complaint became a review. Not disciplinary, but enough to pull me off active duty temporarily. It was framed as concern for readiness after a traumatic call. On paper, it made sense. In reality, it felt like a door quietly closing. Colton moved more openly then. His car appeared in my old parking spot regularly. Brielle stopped pretending discretion mattered. The shift from secrecy to confidence was abrupt. I found out through a mutual acquaintance that she had already spoken to a realtor. Not to sell, but to discuss options. That night, I packed the rest of my belongings while they were gone. I moved efficiently, avoiding sentiment. Clothes, documents, personal items. I left the shared furniture untouched. I did not leave a note. As I loaded the last box into my truck, I noticed a neighbor watching from her balcony. She looked away quickly, but the message was clear. People were paying attention now. The story was no longer private. What Brielle and Colton did not realize yet was that every step they took made the truth easier to trace. Their confidence created patterns. Their coordination left evidence behind. I did not need to confront them again. The situation had moved beyond personal arguments. The fire had taught me something important about containment. When something burns unchecked, it eventually reaches a point where it exposes everything connected to it. They had reached that point, and the consequences were no longer going to stay behind closed doors. The shift from rumor to record happened quietly, the way serious damage usually does. One day I was temporarily reassigned under the explanation of post-incident review, and the next day my access badge did not open every door it used to. No announcement was made. No accusations were spoken aloud. The change lived in procedures, in forms, in polite conversations that suddenly carried legal weight. I was asked to provide a statement about my well-being. The request came from an administrator I had known for years, someone who had watched me work fires that pushed people past their limits. He framed it as routine. I understood better. Once concern was documented, it created a paper trail that could not be erased by good intentions. The allegations themselves were vague, which made them dangerous. Emotional volatility. Difficulty separating work stress from personal behavior. Reports of tension at home. None of it could be disproven easily because none of it described a specific incident. It painted a picture without drawing lines. I knew where it came from, but knowing did not make it easier to counter. I requested copies of everything tied to the complaint. That slowed things down. Requests always did. While administrators reviewed policies and timelines, I focused on the only thing still fully under my control: facts. I pulled my call logs, shift schedules, Incident reports from the warehouse fire and the weeks leading up to it. I built a timeline that showed exactly where I had been and when. Long hours, consecutive overnight calls, mandatory overtime, not as a defense, but as context. At the same time, other pieces began surfacing on their own. A coworker from Brielle's office reached out anonymously at first. Then, after a short exchange, openly. She said she felt uncomfortable with how the situation had been described internally. The version being shared did not match what she had seen. She mentioned conversations where Brielle spoke about needing to establish distance before things became official with Colton. She remembered those words because they were said casually, as if the plan was already decided. That phrasing mattered. Another message came from someone else in the same building. This one mentioned Colton directly. He had been introduced as Brielle's partner weeks before I ever came home and knocked on that door. The firefighter fiancé was referenced as a complication, not as a person. I documented everything. Dates, names, screenshots where possible. I did not share them yet. Meanwhile, Brielle escalated. She contacted someone higher up in my department, someone she knew through a charity event years earlier. The conversation was framed as concern again. She expressed fear for her safety, citing emotional unpredictability rather than physical acts. It was carefully worded, almost rehearsed. That was when the situation crossed a line. Fear, once spoken in an official context, demanded response. I was placed on extended administrative leave pending evaluation. My locker was sealed. My name was temporarily removed from active rotation boards. The explanation was procedural, but the result felt personal. Colton began appearing more openly connected to her public life. Photos surfaced online from gatherings I had never been invited to. He stood close. His posture said permanence. The comments beneath those posts treated the relationship as long established. I watched all of it without reacting. The evaluation process moved slowly. It always did. I met with a department-appointed counselor, someone neutral whose job was not to judge, only to assess readiness. We talked about the fire, about accumulated stress, about my reaction to betrayal without using that word. I answered honestly, sticking to verifiable events. At the same time, Brielle filed a supplemental statement. This one included a claim that she had considered leaving the apartment earlier but feared how I would react. Again, no incident was cited. Just implication. That statement triggered a separate review. I was advised to retain legal counsel, not because charges were imminent, but because the overlap between employment review and personal allegation created exposure. I followed that advice. The attorney listened carefully. He asked precise questions. He explained something important early on. False narratives often collapse under their own weight, but only if allowed to progress far enough to contradict themselves. Interrupting too early sometimes strengthen them. So I waited. The contradictions came faster than expected. Colton, confident now, spoke too freely at a work event. He joked about how difficult it was to step into a situation where someone else was still technically involved. Someone overheard. Someone remembered. That comment made its way back to the same people who had been told I was unstable and unpredictable. The timelines no longer matched. A financial review connected to the apartment lease added another layer. Brielle had attempted to remove my name without proper notice, citing concerns that did not align with lease requirements. That attempt was documented. So was the reason she gave. When asked to clarify, she provided a different explanation than the one already on record. Those inconsistencies mattered. My attorney requested a consolidated review, tying the personal allegations to the employment implications. That forced communication between departments that had previously been operating separately. Information that had been siloed was now shared. The narrative began to fracture. I was called in again, this time to answer questions not about my behavior, but about Brielle's statements. The tone had shifted. There was skepticism now, not directed at me, but at the situation as a whole. Colton disappeared from social media shortly after. Photos were removed. Accounts went private. That kind of cleanup always came too late. A final piece arrived unexpectedly. A neighbor from the apartment building submitted a statement on her own. She described multiple evenings where Brielle and Colton argued loudly, sometimes about timing, sometimes about money. She mentioned seeing me only once during that entire period, the night I knocked on the door. That observation undermined the image of constant tension attributed to me. By the time the reviews concluded, the shape of the situation had changed completely. The concern that once centered on my stability now focused on the credibility of the claims made against me. I was cleared for reinstatement, pending one final administrative step. Brielle was informed of the outcome before I was. Her reaction was immediate. She attempted to retract earlier statements, reframing them as misunderstandings amplified by stress. The retractions did not carry the same weight as the originals. Colton cut contact soon after. His absence was sudden and complete. People noticed. When I returned to the station to retrieve my belongings, the atmosphere had shifted again. Conversations resumed. Doors opened. The place felt familiar in a way it had not since the night I came home covered in soot. The lie had needed witnesses to survive. Once those witnesses compared notes, it could not hold its shape. What remained now were consequences that no one could smooth over quietly. The final decisions did not arrive with drama. They came in emails, stamped documents, and quiet meetings that lasted less time than the damage they addressed. I was reinstated fully, my status restored without conditions, my record amended to reflect that the allegations lacked substantiation. The language mattered. It meant the story could not be retold the way it had been told before. Walking back into the station as active personnel again felt steady rather than triumphant. The engines were louder than I remembered. The floor vibrated under my boots in a way that grounded me. People nodded. A few clapped me on the shoulder. No one asked for details. In that place, outcomes spoke for themselves. Brielle did not get the same kind of resolution. Her employer initiated a separate review once the shared information made its way across departments. The issue was not personal conduct alone. It was misrepresentation that had affected another employee's professional standing outside the company. That kind of exposure carried risk they could not ignore. She was placed on leave, then reassigned, then quietly released from the role she had held for years. The official reason did not mention me. It did not need to. The apartment lease dispute ended the same way. My name was removed cleanly. The financial review uncovered enough irregularities to require reimbursement. It was not punitive. It was corrective. The number attached to it was not small. Colton vanished from the situation completely. Not slowly, not with excuses. He stopped answering messages. He withdrew from shared circles. Someone mentioned he had applied for a transfer again. Someone else said he had already left. The speed of his exit matched the confidence of his earlier presence. Both were revealing. The social version of events corrected itself without my involvement. People compared notes. Timelines aligned. What had once been framed as concern became recognized as orchestration. Sympathy shifted accordingly. Invitations stopped arriving for Brielle. Conversations ended early. The same discretion that once protected her now isolated her. I did not confront her again. There was nothing left to clarify. The engagement was dissolved through standard channels. Rings and documents were exchanged through intermediaries. The process was efficient, almost impersonal, which suited me. I did not want closure framed as conversation. I wanted separation made final. There were quieter consequences too, the kind that did not generate paperwork. Brielle's family reached out once, not to argue or defend, but to ask what had happened. I explained only what was necessary, sticking to events rather than interpretation. The call ended politely. It did not continue. A few weeks later, I ran into her unexpectedly at a grocery store. She looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but in posture. She noticed me and turned away quickly. The moment passed without acknowledgement. That was enough. Life settled into a different rhythm after that. Not better in a dramatic sense, but clearer. My schedule normalized. Sleep returned in longer stretches. The after effects of the warehouse fire faded, replaced by the routine strain that came with the job and no longer followed me home. The department closed the incident officially. The file was archived. Training resumed. New calls came in. Work filled the space that had been hollowed out. People asked occasionally how I was doing. I answered honestly. I was functioning. I was focused. I was present. Those answers satisfied them. What stayed with me was not anger or regret, but the understanding of how quickly narratives could form when absence created opportunity. I had believed consistency was enough. I had believed showing up when it mattered would be recognized automatically. The experience corrected that assumption. Trust, I learned, did not erode loudly. It thinned gradually, redistributed quietly, until one day the door opened to someone else. I moved to a smaller place closer to the station. It had fewer rooms and less history. That suited me. I furnished it simply. I kept nothing that belonged to another version of my life. The first time I came home after a late call and unlocked the door myself, the silence felt earned. The fire that started everything became a reference point rather than a wound. We still talked about it during training sessions. Lessons were drawn. Procedures were updated. The job moved forward. So did I. The consequences had done their work without spectacle. Careers adjusted. Relationships dissolved. Stories lost their audience. And when I came home now, there was no confusion about whose life was waiting on the other side of the door.